Data Privacy Notice. De La Salle College of St. Benilde, or DLSCSB, respects your right to privacy and is committed to protect the confidentiality of your personal information, thus has adapted necessary organizational, technical, and physical measures to secure it. DLSCSB is bound to comply with the Data Privacy Act of 2012, or RA 10173, its implementing rules and regulations, and relevant issuances of the National Privacy Commission. By participating in this video meeting, conference, or webinar, you are consenting to our collection and use of information, including recording, in accordance with this privacy notice. Information is also processed via video conferencing platform Zoom. Please refer to their privacy policy at the website. The information processed, such as name, email address, your image, video, and audio, will be used for attendance, documentation, communication, and systems administration purposes by authorized individuals of department, office, or unit organizing the event, and other offices authorized to have access. We also use the information gathered from you for abuse prevention and privacy protection. DLSCSB shall only retain the said personal information until it serves its purpose, after which it shall be securely disposed of. Queries and complaints can be directed to the Data Protection Officer via email at dpo@benilde.edu.ph.
Today I'll be making a case on what if architecture cannot or does not only exist in the physical space where the metric system is applicable. What if architecture can possibly invade into foreign territory like the digital space, and with talks about the metaverse just beyond the horizon, how do we deal with it? So today I'll be talking about things that are kind of very similar. So please bear with me if I might seem redundant. And I'm sorry if I have to impose this task on you that you maybe need to spot these minute differences. But thank you for your patience. So these are the contents I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction about my work. Next, I'm going to discuss why we need to think about post-human ideas in today's contemporary society. Third is I'm going to be talking about post-human theory specific in architecture and design. So I'll try my best to kind of give an overview about these post-human ideas. And finally, I'll be talking about some of my works and how it kind of relates to these post-human ideas. So I'm Gab. I'm an architect and I graduated in CSB way back in 2017. My background is in architecture, but I'm very fascinated about the digital. And my work today is actually in tech, specifically as an interaction designer in Make Technology, where we design user experiences, user interfaces in various platforms, apps, web, AR and VR. Um, Also, my creative research involves the following. So I'm interested in post-digital cultures, digital spatiality, augmented reality, and um, the formalism that emerges in the digital space, um, which will be more clearer as we move forward through this talk. Um, so one of the first problems that we encounter when we try to think about the post-human thinking in design is that today in contemporary society, we are now living within invisible risks. As I have mentioned earlier, one of these risks or invisible risks is the coronavirus, um, which was further elaborated here by Ferdacolatan. So before I discuss Ferdacolatan, I would like to reiterate that the coronavirus has all of these facets that are in it, diba? We can talk about vaccines in relation to coronavirus. We can talk about Wuhan in relation to coronavirus, politics even in relation to coronavirus. So all of these things, all of these topics are very dissimilar and very independent from each other. Pero lahat sila fall under the same umbrella, which is coronavirus. And this quality, this multifaceted quality of coronavirus, having multiple parts despite being one singular object, is what Timothy Morton calls a hyper object. So hyper objects are these large phenomenon, large things that have very specific parts that you can articulate on. And the hyperobject is one way of how we can think about post-human theory in architecture and design. And later on, we'll be discussing more about these hyperobjects. So going back to the coronavirus discussion, way back in 2020, Ferda Colatan, an architect who dabbles with post-human ideologies, he's an architect in he's a lecturer in the University of Pennsylvania, and in one of his studios, he and his students together explored the idea of empty architecture. So here, they are now adding a new dimension to how we discuss coronavirus, this time in relation to the cities, particularly their cities in the West. And it would also be interesting if we can explore that here. So during the height of the pandemic, they noticed that architecture becomes more and more um, misused and unused because people are locked in their own spaces. And when they revisit specific areas in Pennsylvania, they notice that the forms of these of the built environment is now perceived differently. Dati yung mga upuan, inuupuan ng mga tao, public spaces are used as parks. But today, because of its empty slate, you now look at these objects in a new light. So they kind of reframed their studio in what if we can use the built environment differently from how it was experienced or used pre-pandemic. So here you can see that the forms of the chairs were now reconfigured into like steps to create these stairs, industrial building parts and components such as pipes na dati ginagamit as containers or conduits for fluids are now used and seen as partitions, maybe walls, and aquariums that were filled with water before were kind of contaminated by organic life. So naging terrarium yung mga aquariums. And it's interesting how they kind of explored uh, the emptiness that happened during the pandemic and how potential new typologies in architecture could emerge when they try to analyze and articulate it further. Another invisible risk that we are experiencing today is Web 3.0, which was articulated by Ma'an Abu Taleb under the Art Agency Journal. So to discuss a bit about Web 3.0, When I was in college, the web was still in Web 2.0. And Web 2.0 was a starting point of, the meme culture, where people from all over the world, anonymous people, were very fascinated about creating memes. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with memes. Um, so Web 2.0 was all about content creation and how any person can, create content for the internet. And as we experience Web 3.0, we now move from creation to ownership. Before, we create content anonymously. Today, anyone can stream, anyone can be a vlogger, and vlogging and creating content is now becoming a brand, and people kind of monetize on that. And, apart from this, we now have talks about cryptocurrency, NFTs, which are actually minting parts of the digital space and kind of, taking ownership of that digital asset. So before, it was kind of absurd to, think about real estate in the digital space, but now it's very widely known, and almost everyone knows how to play Axie. Almost everyone knows how to mint NFTs. And hence, Maan Abu Taleb here kind of identified Web 3.0 or ownership as the start of Web 3.0. And here on the image on the right, this is a project done by Sami Hamim, um, a writer in eFlux. She's also an architect. Samiha Meme was kind of interested in the idea of the content houses. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, because as a millennial, I'm very unfamiliar with content houses because I don't use TikTok. But apparently, when I asked some of my siblings, younger siblings, about this, apparently sikat sila yung mga content houses na to. So yung content houses are mansions somewhere in the West, particularly in LA, Hollywood, um, and Gen Z content creators actually rent out these mansions para sabay-sabay silang mag-create ng content together. And um, it's interesting kasi before the content house typology, all of them were experiencing social media feedback in isolation. So kapag gumagawa sila ng content tong pandemic, popost nila online, tapos nakikita nila yung feedback ng tao, yung mga likes, yung mga comments, and na-experience nila yun autonomously, individually, in their own rooms. And this kind of created a certain degree of loneliness. Now, what if negative yung feedback? It kind of heightened the feeling of anxiety, and which often leads to depression. And maybe because of the extreme lockdowns, the extreme isolations that happened during the pandemic, nagkaroon ng urge or extreme urge para maging collective yung experience of social media feedback. And hence, all of these guys kind of communicated with each other, and they rented out mansions in Hollywood, um, which was funded because of their content. And sabay-sabay nilang na-experience yun, yung feedback na yun. And si Sami Hamim, ang ginawa niya, she actually went to the Instagram pages of these content creators, and she noticed how the rooms and spaces inside of the content houses kind of change program, and its function constantly changes depending on who used that space. So she kind of mapped out every content creator who was using the content house, and she mapped out how each one uses the space. So one content creator uses the living room as a dance studio. One content creator uses the living room as like this discussion space to talk about anime and things like that. And also the way the camera from their smartphones frames the space, and how their videos look in Instagram changes the way people perceive the space. So all of these factors may map out ni Samihamin to create this sort of floor plan or a planimetric of some sorts to convey the spatiality of a content house through the lens of Instagram. And I think this is very interesting, how architecture can depict digital cultures, particularly architectural drawings, and how they can illustrate the things that are happening in the um, social media space that slowly becomes more spatial with each passing day. So another example of an invisible risk is social media as a heterotopia. So this is articulated by the researchers Kate Sang-won Lee and Huaxin Wei of the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong, or PolyU. So these guys are not architects; they are interaction designers, and they used some of the ideas of Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, which is heterotopia in particular, to kind of create parallels between physical space and social media. Yung heterotopia, this is a concept that was introduced by Foucault to discuss spaces that are non-places. To articulate more further and more tangibly, yung heterotopia is a space where time is perceived differently. An example na ginamit ni Foucault is the French underground bars. Michel Foucault was also part of the LGBTQ plus community in France in the 1960s, and during that time, the environment there was very hostile towards them. And he kind of framed, or he saw the underground French bars as these spaces of freedom where they can discuss absurd things. And time in real space is different from the way they perceive time in those underground bars, because their conversations can jump from something mundane to something absurd. Social media also operates the same way, because if you notice in your feed, if you scroll constantly in your feed from one space, you're looking at a funny meme, and when you jump onto the next post, you're looking at a very serious issue that's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. So the feed kind of becomes this space where various unrelated things are juxtaposed on top of each other, literally stacking in a vertical manner. Um, and you experience it very quickly. And hence, if we try to think about the social media space as this, three-dimensional thing, then we can probably better understand it more. So this image on the right is also a drawing which was done by Sami Hamim, wherein she took the idea of a content house and pushed it further in a way that it creates this city of some sorts, which I think is quite fascinating because it relates to Kate Sang-won Lee and Huaxin Wei's research. So before, when we think about the city, we always imagine this, built environment where we walk around the streets, we commute from our houses to our schools, to our workplaces, we go to the malls in our city. So it's very tangible. But because of the pandemic, the perception of the city became compressed to our feeds, our social media spaces. So the way we perceive our cities today are, through Instagram stories that expire in 24 hours. We often see glimpses of international communities in our feed, which can often be misconstrued um, through content manipulation. And all of these things are factored into how we experience our cities today. And hence, maybe it's time for us to rethink our values and how we think linearly about architecture and its relationship to the city. So I'm gonna post this passage here by David Rui in architecture, because I think this is something that can heavily inspire how we think about architecture today. So I'm gonna read it. If in fact we have no access to the thing itself, whatever we think the real is pertains more to how we think the real should look, rather than what it is in an absolute sense. Because of this, there is a representational problem with regard to the real. So there's a problem. And this is where I think architecture is at its best. There is no other human practice that is so much about the problem of the real. Architecture is the first thing that tells us what reality looks like. Um, so, if architecture is now slowly encroaching and invading digital space, and with all the talks about the pandemic, all the talks about Web 3.0, our immersion in social media, yun na yung reality natin yun. We don't, some of us are even scared to go outside. And the way we experience reality, our everyday life, happens in our rooms, in our houses of comfort, places of comfort. And this is our reality. And the more we spend our times inside our spaces of comfort, the more we are immersed into, our gateway to the outside world, which is digital space. And if this is the problem that we experience now in reality, according to David Rui, there's no other human practice that is so much about the problem of the real than architecture. And hence, we have a seat at the table as future architects, you guys, and um, us as designers collectively. I think it's important for us to think about this, and to think about architecture outside the space of just buildings. Now we move on to the tangibility of invisible things. So before we kind of define some of the problems that existed in these invisible problems, but now how do we address this? So how do we make those invisible things more tangible? So in doing so, let me drop some ideas by Walter Benjamin and Ian Bogost. Walter Benjamin kind of mentioned this interesting passage where ideas are objects as constellations are to stars. And in relation to this, Ian Bogost, a game developer, a game designer, and a post-human philosopher, kind of mentions this idea wherein what if you can think in constellations, uh, which he mentioned in his book Alien Phenomenology. Now, in relation to architecture, how do we actually think in constellations? This is an example of a diagram done by Peter Eisenman, a theorist whose works were quite predominantly influential during the 60s up to the 80s, and sometime in the 90s during the advent of generative design and architecture. Peter Eisenman is quite famous for this very strictly mechanical linear process wherein you start out from a base geometry and you manipulate it further step by step. And with each step, you kind of address a specific design problem, not necessarily solve it, but address it. And as you address those problems, you move forward through the process until you reach the final output, which is architecture. Um, so this way of thinking is kind of reiterated today in the contemporary architecture scene. We can see some variations of this in some diagrams of OMA, Rem Koolhaas, and Shohei Shigematsu, and even Rainer de Graaf. We also see this in some diagrams done by Dirk Ingels, which we are all so familiar with. Well, during my batch, diagrams of Dirk Ingels became very, very widely used, and sometimes it becomes very tedious to look at. But um, in going back to those diagrams, you notice that in Dirk Engels diagrams that you have this base form, which is often an extrusion of the site. Then you twist this geometry here to create visual connections. You extrude this part in order for the entrance to reveal, which allows people to come into your building. You map out the sun path so that you subtract perforations to capture sunlight in the western parts of the world where it's very cold. So it's very linear. But what if you can think about architecture as something, generative and spontaneous rather than something so mechanical and so strict? So this is a diagram done by Lancaster Research Group, wherein they tried to map out how cybersecurity functions in relation to smart homes. Smart homes are, becoming increasingly familiar today. And if bumibili kayo ng mga products ng Me, which was previously Redmi, you notice that you can actually turn on your lights, turn on your refrigerators using your phones through your apps. And these researchers were concerned on anong mangyayari sa data natin kapag nilagay natin siya sa app. Saan mapupunta yun? And, yung pathway ng data mo is kind of very abstract. It's considered as something highly technical, even in the tech field. But it's something that is very pressing and very important. So these guys tried to map out using a constellation diagram on how data travels from the object through the database and back to the object. So here, you can start out the diagram in any step here, and you just need to follow the arrows so that you can see the relationship of one step to another. Also, some of the parts are grouped together by themes and zones, which is represented by these broken lines here. And here, you create a diagram that illustrates very independent and autonomous things and how they kind of distort each other in one sphere. Parang ganun. So, pwede kong basahin yung diagram um, as a starting point here, and I can end here, or I can start it here and I can probably end up here. So this is the essence of constellation mapping, and how do we try to use this in architecture. Now, I'm gonna try to enumerate some post-human theories as constellations. Using constellation mapping, ni Walter Benjamin and ni Ian Bogost, I'll try to enumerate some post-human theories that we can use to design architecture or think about architectural things. So first, I think some of my students here are familiar with Heidegger's broken tool. So Martin Heidegger is a philosopher who kind of dabbled with phenomenology. Pero I think mas important tong broken tool rather than Heidegger's phenomenology. The broken tool is essentially how tools and objects kind of become invisible pag ginagamit mo na siya. Kunwari, he used the example of a hammer. So if you are using a hammer, you are not concerned with the hammer's parts. Hindi mo masyado pinapansin yung handle niya, hindi mo pinapansin yung texture ng bakal ng hammer. You're more concerned with the act of hammering, and you're even more conscious na baka, you're more careful na baka hindi tamaan yung kamay mo when you're hammering a nail onto a surface. And suddenly, when the hammer breaks, you enter into this mode of troubleshooting na suddenly, kapag nasira ang isang tool, mas nagiging specific yung pagtingin mo sa mga parts niya. This is basically the essence of the broken tool by Heidegger. Na if a tool becomes broken, it suddenly becomes more tangible. Its presence becomes more stronger. Now, if we try to map this out using a constellation process, so, here I'm gonna try to just lay it out chronologically, but you can actually read the final output of this very non-linearly. So the broken tool is actually an object that is dismantled. It is often related to the act of hammering, and which, yun yung ginamit na term ni Heidegger to describe the process of the object that is being dismantled. And when you dismantle the object, its parts becomes more specific, and hence with specificity, you can invent new things because you're actually naming those parts that were previously not seen. Diba? Earlier, we discussed na yung coronavirus becomes more specific, and we invent new terms such as Delta or Omicron as we discover new parts of it. Tangibility, which often leads to phenomenology. What if you become more conscious about the parts, and when you become more conscious of it, mas nadidetalye mo siya. And in architecture, detailing is very important. And if you become more conscious about the ubiquitous architectural components, such as a window, such as a door, the floor, all of these things, if we are hyper aware of it, we can introduce more forms to it, more functions to it. And hence, this creates a new way on how we perceive phenomenology in architecture. And of course, it also plays a huge role in context building. If we are to articulate the parts more specifically, mas nagkakaroon tayo ng way to create um, new contexts. Usually, in architecture, we're always more concerned with contextualism. Diba? We often study the site and we relate our architectural objects to the context. But here, what if it can happen conversely? What if architecture can actually build the context through its specific parts? Now, for example, I imagine the SDA building and its huge cantilever, wherein it often, introduces a presence onto the site which wasn't previously there. So, because of that cantilever, that specific part, it kind of creates a context below. So that's just one example of it. Now, an architect who kind of explored this quite heavily is Tom Wiscombe of the Southern California Institute of Architecture in the States, wherein in his studio, he kind of explored the use of super components. So super components are actually objects that are very specific and is part of a whole. So na-inspire si Tom Wiscombe sa mga model kits ng Gundam, if you guys are familiar with that, wherein you have these very specific parts and you assemble it together to, create a whole. So Tom Wiscombe and together with his students kind of explored this idea further, wherein they used super components in relation to architecture. And each super component here can be considered as an individual building in itself. So may specific function tong building na to, ito, and so on and so forth. But when you put them together, may synchronicity na nangyayari despite of them having very different functions. And yung assembled piece of architecture that happens through the amalgamation of super components can be perceived as a building, and it also can be perceived as a city. So pwede mo siyang tignan as a small city or this one large building. And yun yung essence ng super components ni Tom Wiscombe, na it kind of blurs the boundaries between architecture and urbanism. Next is the object-oriented ontology by Graham Harman, or Triple O, and I'll be talking about his idea of objects. So yung objects are basically what reality consists of. It's like matter. So kung yung matter is to science, objects is to object-oriented ontology. And hence, if lahat ng bagay sa reality na to can be classified as objects according to Harman, nagkakaroon ng flatness sa hierarchy ng things. Before, during the 90s, very predominant yung paradigm ng anthropocentric architecture. Doon na uso doon nag-start mag-proliferate yung idea ng human-centered design. But today, there are talks that maybe we need to go beyond the lens of human-centered design and maybe think about reality as not something that is so anthropocentric, but me as an object is equal to the plant behind me, which is also an object, and that plant may equal to a dog or a cat or even non-living things such as my phone. And because of this flatness na nangyayari, we are now confronted with more parameters when we design things. Maybe ergonomics shouldn't just talk about human scale, but maybe we should think about post-human scale. What if we design buildings for cats? buildings for plants, and buildings for smartphones, if that's even possible. Um, so again, it also talks about parts, wherein parts becomes more specific and more independent and more autonomous. And um, because of the independence of those parts, yung relationship ng mga components of isang building doesn't necessarily need to be relational. Di ba kanina si Björk Ingels, when I was talking about him, each step of the architectural process is often related and inextricably linked with each other. Sa non-relational approach, you can actually create architecture that is independent from another, and at the same time, they can be adjacent to each other. So, like what I mentioned earlier, if we are more specific about the window, we can design it more independently than the floor. And if we are more specific about our floors, we can design it independently from our doors. And it can actually possess more functions, diba? Our doors can probably become chairs in the future. The window sills of our windows can become a table. And, the architectural component, the basic, its most fundamental form, can evolve even further to accommodate more functions. And hence, the way you experience the built environment will become more diverse and more interesting. And object-oriented ontologies can be more analogous rather than relational. And this, I think, what makes object-oriented ontology very fascinating. So an example of its application in architecture is the entry of Jimenez Lai of Bureau Spectacular. He is a lecturer in UCLA in Los Angeles, and this is his entry to the 14th, if I'm not mistaken, Architecture Biennale, wherein he represented the Taiwan Pavilion. So these objects that you see here are actually explorations on domesticity of interior spaces. So Jimenez Lai was kind of interested about what if urbanism can exist inside your interior spaces? What if we treat each furniture as something that, you know, what if we treat individual furnitures as like buildings in themselves, wherein they have these contained, activity that's happening inside of them, apart from them already existing in an interior space. So this is what Jimenez Lai was interested in, creating objects inside an interior space that are independent from each other, but you can use it the way you use a space. Now, for example, this is the dining pavilion. This is the cooking pavilion. This is the sleeping palace or some sort, wherein each space is actually an object. And here, when we think about space, diba? When we think about space in our houses, we often relate it as a division of a larger room. And yung pag-divide natin sa space is often done using walls. But here, you can actually rent out one large space. And instead of dividing the space up using walls, you can actually design objects that are very specific and distribute them in that large space. Now, moving forward, we now talk about the hyper objects by Timothy Morton, which is we already encountered this previously when we talked about the coronavirus. Excuse me, nawawala yung boses ko, but moving on, hyper objects by Timothy Morton. As I had mentioned before, these things are physically large, and because of its largeness, it becomes more ambiguous and more obscure. Kasi when we encounter large things, we often get the feeling of nonchalance and neglect. Because of the complexity of a certain thing, tinatamad tayong aralin siya. Kapag medyo komplikadong isang bagay, nawawala na kagad yung interest natin when we're studying it. But these large objects are actually very high resolution. So yung parts niya, even though the whole is very blurred, yung parts niya are in high resolution. So we can actually perceive it very clearly, and hence it's more comprehensible. So instead of understanding yung hyper objects as, instead of addressing it as this singular large entity, let's dissect it into its very specific parts. And because of this, uh, its meaning is more comprehensible. It becomes ontologically tiny. Mas nadadigest natin siya more easily. And this is how I usually approach architecture and design. When we address something so complex such as architecture, with all of the factors about sustainability, about human centrism, about overpopulation, about density, you cannot address this directly head on. You must actually focus on the parts and articulate the parts in a way that it becomes more ontologically tiny. Like for example, this talk, I've been dropping very possibly complex things like triple O and hyper objects and um, the broken tool by Heidegger, and it can be quite daunting. But if we try to dissect it part by part, it becomes actually this tiny ontological thing that we can absorb. Um, Hyperobjects in relation to architecture was heavily explored by Mark Foster Gage, a professor in Yale University. Um, Here, he actually tried to think about the high resolution quality of the hyperobject and how he can use that to design buildings. So Mark Foster Gage is heavily influenced by machine learning, wherein he actually trained computers to kind of figure out patterns, and he uses the computers to kind of design architecture with him. um, this image on the right is actually an exploration on how computers can learn fractal patterns and how they can actually distribute those patterns as circulation spaces and details of a piece of building or a piece of architecture. And he pushes this further by exploring its application in interior space, which could possibly look like this. So he was very interested in how you can actually misuse computer algorithms to create these new conceptions of interior spaces. Also, he was interested in the aesthetic value of everyday objects, such as this project right here, which is his entry to the Guggenheim Helsinki, I think in 2014, wherein nag-scan siya ng everyday objects using a 3D scanner, and he used the computer again to kind of distribute parts of those 3D scanned objects across various places in the facade and the interior space of the building to create this building that looks like a sculpture, wherein he creates this, parallelism between a museum that is a sculpture and that which hosts sculptures. So I think that's kind of interesting there, how he used this idea of kit bashing to create a new architectural typology. And also, I would like to mention how thinking in constellations can kind of blur the lines that separates disciplines. Here, in locally, there's this, or even globally, there's this conception that creative disciplines are kind of holed up into specific spheres that are contained and are external from other creative disciplines, not just in architecture, but also in engineering, in graphic design, in object design, in art, which is very distant in architecture here locally. But in our work in Make Technology, we kind of explored how we can sort of lay out the creative disciplines in such a way that we can think about how we can influence other disciplines. So here, we positioned architecture in conjunction or adjacent to art and industrial design. So this diagram right here is heavily influenced by the scale of the output of these things, wherein art here is very ambiguous, which ranges from something very tiny to something very large. Architecture being subsequent to that, industrial design, which is the creation of furniture, and part of this talk, which is basically a brief scanning of some of the things that I've done in the past years in relation to my fascinations about post-human thinking. So here is a project wherein uh, I collaborated with these guys, Joey Ocampo, Jose Hobilla, and the Alphabet Group to think about a city that actually looks like an object. And in this object, you can actually merge two scales, that of a town and that of a business district. So we use the site Mumbai because it has those two fabrics, a town and a central business district. And here we also explore the relationship of, local programs such as fishery and global programs such as, stock trading and investing, and how all of these can happen in one object. So this is the output of Circular Mumbai, wherein when you look at this city, you can actually look at it in two ways: one large building or one very compressed small city, which happens in a vertical manner. Also, we were conscious about thinking about how sprawl can happen vertically. um, Urban sprawl doesn't necessarily need to happen on the ground, and verticality doesn't necessarily need to be exaggerated, that it creates this skyscraper that looms over very small towns. So what if you create an object that kind of merges those two scales together, that of a town and that of a city? These are some renderings of that project. So here you have open spaces, and below you have these amalgamation of live work play spaces that you experience in a town like manner. So from afar you look at this object as something that is very urban, but when you experience it inside, it actually simulates the town like feel of the city below. And we were conscious about um, we in planning or in urban architecture, we think about zoning as um, that which relates to maps. But what if zoning can happen in an object-like manner, wherein you can impose a parameter wherein you only use a circle to kind of group things together into programs to create architecture, or in this case, an architecture that mimics a city. So these are some of the form finding diagrams that we explored on how architecture can be a sort of urbanism in a sense. Another project of mine, which is an inverse of Circular Mumbai, is desk urbanism, wherein I was very interested in micro architecture and how the personalization of desks um, in work or in studios in school kind of leads to very specific parts in your desks, which wherein you look at your desk now as this sort of mini city. So this is the a personal project that I did, wherein I kind of explored the zoning and how you can actually zone different programs on your desks. This space could be a storage space. This place could be a play space. This space could be the workspace, and everything happens in that one linear block, which is your desk. And I was very conscious about designing the parts very specifically, wherein the storage space doesn't necessarily need to be a grid. It could be this engaging, almost anthropomorphic like thing that when you encounter it, you don't know how to approach it on at first, and hence every time you use it differently. You can use it as a display space. You can use it as a storage space. You can use it as a house for your cats or your pets, and things like that. And I call that object the mechanical desk or the mech desk. And this is some attempts when we tried to like fabricate that, and we tried to design very specific parts in such a way that it fits one ply of plywood. Also, I was interested in game environments, and there's this game during the height of the pandemic called Animal Crossing, where people kind of meet up in some digital islands and they kind of play games together. They kind of spend time together. um, but it's interesting. I was particularly interested in how people designed their islands in such a way that it mimics real life islands, even though everything happens in a digital space. So why do people relate this to physical things if it doesn't happen in physical space? So I conceived my island as a project wherein what if I explored new materials, new forms of materiality, so that the way you interact with my island becomes very different from how people interact in physical space. So No Future or Supergrid is my island, which I designed as a project to kind of figure out new ways on how you can experience digital space. So I was very conscious on how I can create very synthetic textures rather than textures that are very realistic. So I embraced the nature of the ambiguous digital space to create new objects. So, if you embrace something as new, you can take ownership of new things that you will invent within that domain. Another project is Objectscapes, which I have done under the Authenticity Zero Collective, which is the art group that I constantly work with. In the Objectscapes, I was interested in sculpture naman, and how the wastes from my office, the 3D printed waste can be reconfigured into a sculpture. And I was interested in Mark Foster Gage's process of kit bashing, wherein instead of you think about design as form creation, what if we can think about design as curation and organization? So because of the uncontrolled forms of 3D printed waste, often interactions become inexact and forms become unintentional and experience becomes serendipitous rather than exact. So these are the examples of those sculptures that are now framed in these black boxes. And in pushing that further, I found a connection with this piece that I designed in 2016, wherein what if those objectscapes can expand into something more larger? This is singularities and multiplicities, wherein I kind of experimented with the kit bashing of blobs. So this is an art installation that also acts as this spatial thing that people can interact with from the top of the amphitheater. This also happened in SDA, by the way, and people can interact with it by passing with the hall through the hallways or even experiencing the inside of it here, which is demarcated by these L-shaped containers right here. So in relation to that, we also explored how objects can be receptacles of meaning. So this was done in relation to the Kalinga tattoo, which was also something that we considered when we designed this object. Now, there came a time where I was interested in typography, and in work, we were trying to think about new ways on how we can use abstract forms to kind of uh, create scripts, Latin scripts that you can use as elements for graphic design. So here, naging conscious kami about the parts of a typeface and how you can actually use abstract forms to simulate those parts. This is the first iteration of SynType. As you know, if you noticed, all of the parts of the typeface are only composed of three things. This was heavily influenced by Rowena Reed Costello's process of the rectilinear problem, wherein you have a dominant, subdominant, and subordinate component and you superimpose them on top of each other to create this composition. And what if you create a composition based on that pattern to create, a font or a typeface? And also this, we push this idea further by creating this, instead of strictly adhering to Latin type forms, we kind of use the 9 square grid to create this writing notation of some sorts, to create a way of writing using a 9 square grid and linear and box type geometries. And we also explored how that can scale up in terms of the type form's weight. So this is the thin type form and this is the bold type form. And I think there were talks that what if we can use italicized in this format? What's it gonna look like? So this is the second iteration of syntype. So I now move on to the last parts of the presentation, wherein currently I'm interested in augmented reality, and this is one of my first explorations of augmented reality through the platform of Artists for Digital Rights Network, wherein we explored the how artists can address disinformation that's happening on social media. And my premise was, in order to make something in social media very visible, we can probably use three-dimensional tools and spatiality to bring it into the frontier of users. So this is the disinformation interface, which is actually an architectural object or a digital object or somewhere in between that people can, just scan this code, and the disinformation object can be manifested in your space through your smartphones. This project has this poetic lens to it, so there's this romantic dimension to it rather than something rational. Hence, I cannot fully classify this as architecture. That's why I consider this as art. But if you try scanning this object, you can actually interface with the disinformation interface right there in your home. Um, yeah, and this is also a means on how we can kind of spread awareness about disinformation, especially with the recent elections coming up. So this is different ways on how you can experience the disinformation interface. You can experience it as a space like this. You can experience it as an object or an external structure that exists in physical reality. And lastly, the still reality of objects is one of the recent endeavors that I have conceptualized for our grad school exhibition, wherein we used augmented reality to kind of slow down how we perceive digital space. And here we designed three different types of objects: plant-like objects, screen-like objects, and digital noise-like objects. And I was fascinated about how people kind of interact with the forms of these spaces. And I actually distributed these objects across people and friends across different countries in the world. And there, because of their interactions with these objects, I kind of figured out how the pandemic situation is in their specific parts of their world. So here in the Philippines, people were interested in picking these plant-like objects kasi they probably spend most of their time in their homes, and hence some of the pictures that they took were of interior spaces. People naman from Melbourne were interested in picking these abstract objects wherein they see it as public installations, and hence their pictures of it were actually in their parks, and hence lockdowns were probably less frequent there. So it's a way on how you can map out phenomena in various places through the use of objects. So these are some examples of it. This is an image by Tata Yap in Hong Kong, and this is also an image which was taken by her. This is an image by Mark Buscato in Melbourne, and Alexis Guerra here in Makati. So to conclude, I'm gonna try to condense all of the things that I've mentioned into bite-sized chunks to make them, ontologically tiny. Post-human design traverses disciplines. It doesn't necessarily need to be holed up in, one discipline. And in fact, post-human design kind of encourages cross-pollination of these creative disciplines. Post-human architecture is scalable. So the things that you learn um, when you study post-human architecture can be transferable to other disciplines like user interface, graphic design, furniture design, and etc. Post-human thinking is nonlinear, which is in relation to the constellation mapping of Ian Bogost and Walter Benjamin. And I would like to ask you guys this question. What do you think about post-human design? Do you think it could possibly, you know, um, what is its role in the future of architecture, possibly other disciplines, if you guys can think about any anymore? So with that, I conclude my talk. Thank you for listening. Wala na akong boses.
Thank you very much, Sir Gab, for your very insightful and informative and perhaps a new perspective in architecture for me. Ayun. So, guys, let's give Sir Gab a virtual applause.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So let's now proceed to our Q&A. So anyone who wants to ask question, you may raise your hand or type in the chat box so I can read them. So I have one question here from, I think this is Gabriel. Good afternoon, Mr. and Misters. I'm interested to know from Architect Gab, which philosophical material did he begin with in order that he was led to this way of exploration? Where would we begin as students?
That's a difficult question because I'm trying to retrace my but I remember starting out watching debates of the Southern California Institute of Architecture. So you guys can search in YouTube SciArt channel and you can try watching videos of Tom Wiscombe because I think he has the most fundamental way of approaching this. He enumerates clearly naman on how you can use this way of thinking in architecture. And eventually, as you progress, you will be more interested in studying this further. You can read Graham Harman, Object-Oriented Ontology, which is also a professor in SciArc. What else? So yeah, eventually, as you learn to grasp these ideas, you begin to think about this in relation to things outside of architecture, and hence maybe you can add more to the discipline of architecture by bringing in other disciplines to it. I hope that I answered your question.
Well, okay ba yung tanong? Not you, Sir Gab. Gabriel din kasi name niya. Ayun. Wala pa siyang reply. Anyway, Do, do you have a question for Sir Gab?
Hello po. Yes po. Sir Gab, I just have a question. When you conducted your project for your island, did you terraform?
Oh, nag-terraform ako. Why?
I was just curious if parang yung textures na nilagay niyo sa ground, you'd have to terraform to like push through the idea, or you worked around the natural landscape?
Well, I was, if you guys are familiar with the Cora L Works project of Peter Eisenman, he kind of was fascinated with the use of voids that are implanted on the ground and how ground voids, which are very synthetic, can seem natural. So yun yung mga ginagawa ko. I often puncture the ground in grids to kind of be consistent with that idea of syntheticness kasi yung grid kind of simulates that. So yeah, I use Terraform.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir Gab, can you share with us some literature or recommend literature for the students, especially those who are interested in theoretical or diba, where they can stop, especially mga gusto mag-exploration. Marami rin kasi nag-research na. So, pwede kayo.
Yes. First, maybe to start you guys off with digestible literature, go to Off-Ramp by SciArc. Yun yung online journal nila, Off-Ramp. And I often reference SciArc kasi sila talaga yung nagdadouble with object-oriented ontology. And Patrick Schumacher, yung homeboy ni Zaha Hadid, was very impressed about their consistency, even though Patrick Schumacher kind of heavily antagonizes object-oriented ontology because he is a champion of parametricism. He kind of commends SciArc because of that. So first, watch videos and debates in SciArc, then try to read some off-ramp issues. Then from there, you can probably digest more technical literature like Object-Oriented Ontology by Graham Harman or Alien Phenomenology by Ian Bogost. What else? Hyperobjects by Timothy Morton, and some books of Tom Wiscombe are quite rare, like yung Objects, Models, and Worlds. But if you can get your hands on that, it's also very insightful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How about the others? Meron pa bang gustong magtanong? Parang na-overwhelm yata sila, sir, dun sa iyong mga presentations. Sir Andrew, nandiyan ka pa ba? How about you?
Hi, Sir Gab.
Hi, Sir Andrew.
Hi, Miss Erica. Yeah. Tama si Miss Erica, na-overwhelm ako. It's very interesting. No? It's very interesting because for the most part, I understood what you were talking about. No, but it's interesting because I'm not really a theoretical guy. No, like philosophies and all that stuff. No, medyo very base philosophies ang alam ko, and it's not because I don't like to learn it. Maybe it's just because I don't like reading. But the interesting part for me here was when you were talking about, especially when you were specifically talking about constellation thinking, no? Parang I could actually relate, although it's not that complex, but kumbaga, with all design processes, it's about going from point A to point B. The way that you explained yours is a different route, no? But ang ending natin pare-pareho, no? Which is really interesting. I don't know if this is a question, no? But kasi nga, I like how you structured your presentation. You gave your proposal and then you were explaining it. You were explaining it through different disciplines, no? So ang question ko, while I was trying to formulate a question, you were answering it already. And ang takeaway ko dito is the design sensibilities that you created. You can definitely see it working harder because you were able to translate it in all disciplines, diba? And now ang next venture mo is, diba, how are you translating this into Web3 na, diba? Which is very interesting kasi again, while West ang Web3 ngayon, diba? No one knows what it's about.
Yeah.
Diba? And I'm sure with the way that you're approaching design problems, or at least whatever's presented in front of you, I'm interested to see how or what project you would be presenting next that relates to that.
Mhm.
And then, again, may question ba ako? Miss Eric? Wala yata. Wala yata. Alam mo, again, no? Kasi like tayo, di ba, we are taught to design contextually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pero after hearing your talk, parang, can context be overrated? Di ba? Parang, di ba? Can it be overrated? Or, kasi parang may dichotomy sinabi mo kanina, di ba? Like, what you want to do something as specific as possible, but that specificity is also what leads us to create something new and different, di ba? In a way, no? Then what, like, we know how stairs function,
Yeah.
but, di ba? Does it only take
Yeah.
you from one point to another, or can it actually function a different way? And feeling ko right now, no, we are at that junction wherein we are actually questioning what things that are socially
Yeah.
are accepted, di ba?
Yeah.
Parang we are at this stage, di ba? Na okay lang, di ba? Okay lang to rethink things. And yeah, constellation thinking. Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't read much, but I'll probably read one of your references just to start to really learn more about it. But yeah, I enjoyed your talk. No? Tama, wala nga palang question. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Sir Andrew.
Realization ko, biglang plants also have feelings. So parang, mo na consider yun. Masyado tayong you-centered.
Yeah.
Yeah, we forgot about other things and objects. Ayun.
Yeah. I'm gonna share something then, Sir Erica, in relation to what Sir Andrew said. Like, during, I think it was in 2020 when the Architectural Review kind of released a series on interior spaces. And this kind of made me think talaga about, the works of Jimenez Lainga, yung na-mention ko kanina, and si Tom Wiscombe. Kasi people, yung Architectural Review, yung ginawa nila, nagpa-call for submission sila ng mga pictures ng interior spaces. And a lot of these peoples during the height of their lockdowns in their respective countries kind of used interior spaces very differently. Yung mga stairs nila naging, spaces where they play their guitars, and the window sills became a mode of communication with yung mga kapitbahay nila sa tapat nila, apartment buildings in front of their houses. So to echo that that sentiment that now's the time to be exploring new things. I really agree with that.
Okay, meron pa tayo last question, I think, kasi malapit nang magklase. From Sir Elwin. When we think of bubble diagrams and network typologies as examples of object-oriented ontology, also of thinking of buildings as systems of related modules and elements.
What an interesting thought. Yeah. Well, the bubble diagram, I think, is something that can be related to constellation thinking. But I think when we translate it into plans, the autonomy of those bubbles becomes more withdrawn and more watered down. Kasi I understand that there are clients that we need to, satisfy. But if we can do it in such a way that the bubbles become more evident in the output, then I think it could be a better translation of object-oriented ontology. For example, you draw a bubble of a living room here, bubble of a dining room here. Eventually, that space will get melded into this one open plan, right? But if we, design the living room as something independent from the dining room, then maybe that could be closer to object-oriented ontology. And I'm imagining things that maybe the open plan can be something that could be reinvented today, with the interior spaces becoming more diverse. I think it's about time that we can think about the relationship or the independence of these spaces from each other. In terms of building systems and modules and elements, the first thing that came to my mind was how Ferda Colatan in his MT architecture kind of use the forms of utilities or utility components of buildings as partition spaces. Nung hindi na siya ginagamit as daluyan ng fluids, it kind of merits a new use, diba? So um, we can probably think about the forms of these building systems as something independent from their functions, and hence we can probably use them as architectural components, not just utility components. What if pipes could become walls, right? Yeah, I hope that answered your question, sir.
Right? Meron pa bang pahabol questions? Parang ano, medyo nagulat ang mga estudyante sa presentation. Anyway, yeah, I think that's it for today. Let's before we end, let's Sir Aldous, can we share the certificate of appreciation to our speaker for today? Not yet.
I'll stop
Very
sharing.
good. So, ay, nawala ulit. Here. Okay, so the result called this through School of Design and Arts, honored to present this certificate of appreciation to architect Gabriel Luis Jesus Brioso, UAP, for sharing his invaluable knowledge on large objects, tiny ontologies, given this 18th of March via Zoom, signed by architect Harvey and AD Bennett. Yeah, so thank you very much again. That's
Thank you,
Gib,
Miss.
Sir Gab.
Thank you, sirs. Thank you, everyone.
So before we end our program, kindly our participants kindly answer our evaluation form. We will be sharing the link in the chat box too. Sir, pa-share na lang, Sir Aldous, yung link for the evaluation form there. And then next. All right, that's it. Again, thank you very much. I think we will still have webinars in the next weeks. Diba? Meron pa, Miss MC, I think. So I look forward to seeing you again. And thank you, Sir Gab, for the time. Nandito rin pala si Jack. Hi, Jack! O yan, alumdus din natin. Nice to see you. Yun. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. And good luck on your finals, guys. To our faculty who attended, Miss MC, Sir Elwin, Sir Aldous, thank you for your help. Saga, especially Don. Yun. Thank you. And have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Sir Gab, thank you again.